Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks, Cheyenne, for introducing me, and thank you very much to SEER for facilitating the workshop for us today. Just so everyone knows, I have a bit of trouble with my internet, so I'm off right now, but if I get back on, I'll give you a wave when I join. I was really happy to see in the chat box some folks that I've had the opportunity to meet before and to work with, and I look forward to meeting and working with those of you that I haven't been able to meet before. I'll just really quickly introduce myself. So I'm Danielle Prevost. I am, as Cheyenne said, working with Environment Canada on all aspects of stewardship with Indigenous communities across BC with a focus on species at risk. I grew up in northern Alberta, where I come from a family, a ranching family. So I very much grew up kind of in the bush, learning that if you take care of the land, it takes care of you, from simple things like putting in some fence to protect a riparian area and seeing all the wildlife return to that area, to helping improve grasslands through fire and compost and aeration and just various things that we can do on the landscape, and the various things the landscape does for us. And it's just my privilege to be able to work on species at risk directly now, professionally, and to work with communities and together share what we learn and share what we know and increase what we know and learn from each other when it comes to wildlife and particular species risk. So I moved to BC as a young person and grew up in the Seabird Island and Shiam territories, moved to city for school. I now live in Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, and there's so many beautiful places across BC. I'm, of course, kind of biased for the ones I grew up, but I've had the privilege to go everywhere and really welcome the opportunity when we can get together again in person. But for now, this is a pretty nice space. And today, just like always, really looking forward to learning from you, learning more about these species, and having the opportunity to share some of what I know and to answer questions. And like I said, with this, embarking on somewhat of a new conversation. So I'll go to the first slide, please. I just wanted to start, although we're calling this a new conversation, I think it's somewhat of a new approach and a continued enhanced approach for different communities and organizations that we've been working together for many, many years in different ways on species at risk. Through that time, just on this slide, I have some of the things we've heard in the past. So for pretty much everyone I've had the privilege to collaborate with, I've heard that species at risk and their protection and all wildlife and all living things, that stewardship is an inherent responsibility. We all have a lot of information and knowledge that we could share with Indigenous communities. What, how, when that's shared, how it is used is critically important. At Environment Climate Change Canada, we recognize we have a lot to learn in this regard, and also recognizing, as Cheyenne said, there's such a diversity of practices and knowledge and ways of knowing and ways of sharing, that working with you on what does appropriate sharing and use of knowledge mean, and how do we do that to help the recovery of these really important and at-risk species. We've also heard that species at risk is one of many priorities that everyone is facing and working on, and that more capacity is needed. I think everyone can relate to that, including ourselves, to really meaningfully engage. So this project and this, what we're calling a new conversation, is hopefully one way that we can start increasing all of our capacities to meaningfully work together. And then finally, just this point about relationship, partnership, co-development, and leadership are so fundamental. And just want to recognize the leadership in this room and the willingness to partner, that you took the time out today in these really extraordinary times with everything that you have on your plate to take time out to have this conversation with us and on the day of learning and sharing knowledge. So thank you very much for that. Next slide, please. So with this new conversation, as part of this project, the first step is really to try to improve the way we do Species at Risk Act consultation, cooperation, and accommodation for all species. But there are so many species across BC. So for this first step, we're focusing specifically on the 7 species that Cheyenne mentioned there in the beginning. So the project is going to help us work together on many items. We're focusing on those ones in the previous slide that I just highlighted from what we've heard. We've heard many different things. Many things are common, many things are specific to communities. With this project, where we, with our limitations, we're focusing on those areas I previously mentioned, and with the idea that the scope is as broad as everyone wants it to be, and that we're hoping that this conversation just continues to grow over time. So in the next slide, I'll get into this project, the different components involved, and some of the timelines and what it looks like. So here today, we're starting off with a workshop to talk about these 7 species in particular. So there's 3 different dates where we're doing that same workshop. And then through the months of February to mid-March, we're estimating potentially beyond, because as you saw with the doodle polls, we're trying to accommodate people's schedules. And for those of you who aren't able to make sessions or want to discuss in addition to sessions, being flexible around that. And I'll just note that what we have planned coming up for Southern Mountain Caribou are some half-day workshops, and then for grizzly bear, having meetings in coordination with BC. So the other presenters will get into what those entail. And then for the other species, we don't have workshops planned or sessions planned for those species. And so if you're interested in meeting and discussing those more, please do let us know. And then finally, the last workshop in this project itself is around capacity building and training. And the focus is for resource and land managers, but basically anyone who has a role in stewarding the land, making decisions about land use and conservation of wildlife. And so we plan to do that sometime in February or March, again, depending on everyone's availability, which we'll figure out again through a doodle poll. And then on the next slide, just to support this work and this project, we do have some modest capacity funding. And there was an expression of interest sent out with this invitation, as well as information on the website. So Cheyenne, who you met from SARA earlier, is the main point of contact for this, and we'll be able to answer questions about this part of the project. When we receive the expressions of interest, then we will work with the National Aboriginal Council on Species at Risk. This is an organization with representatives across Canada who provide advice to our minister on various aspects of the Species at Risk Act. So they generously offered to be part of this project and to help in the review of the expressions of interest. So there's many things you could do with this capacity funding. There's just a few examples here on the slide and more information in the expression of interest, but I'll just note that the recovery plans that are documents for the different species are a good place to look. And I'm sure everyone here has lots of ideas of what could be done to help support recovery of species. And then on the next is finally is the reporting and evaluation. And as Cheyenne mentioned at the end of the workshop today, we'll talk a little bit Sarah will talk a little bit about that. I'll just say that this project is very new in the way we're doing things, having this capacity support, having this kind of focused approach to working on multiple species at once, because that's what we've heard and what we who work in this field know, that you have to look at a whole system. You have to look at the whole environment. Working species by species has its benefits, but also its challenges. So being able to work this way in a more holistic approach and have a bit of capacity funding to support that is fairly new. So we want to look at how that works, evaluate it, and improve it for future. And then I have just a dotted line arrow going out into future, because some of these sessions will continue, the conversation will continue. The funding for this project with the expressions of interest need to be provided by March 31st, but the work with that funding can continue. And I'm also working to see if I can get additional funding to continue that capacity support going forward. So that's the project and the timeline in a nutshell. I'll go to the next slide, which is just a picture here of the Species at Risk Act itself and some of the different components. So before going into the sessions on the different species, we thought it important just to do an overview of the Species at Risk Act. Some of the folks on the line, you'll be super familiar with the Act, and other people, this might be new. But, you know, when we talk about the Species at Risk Act, we can talk about it in 10 minutes. We can talk about it in 10 years. There's a lot to the Act, and I'm just going to go over some of the key points just to help with our conversation today. And I'll get into these different sections in a moment here. But just before I do that, into the next slide is just a list of all the various organizations involved in the Species at Risk Act, and all have different roles. I won't go through all of them, but I just put this up here because sometimes, you know, you may want to get more information or have questions that aren't part of what Environment and Climate Change Canada is responsible for, but we can help connect you with the right folks. So in a nutshell, we're responsible for terrestrial species and migratory birds, fisheries and oceans as aquatic species, and then you can see a bunch of other organizations involved as well. And also key, and why we're all here today, is the involvement of you and your stewardship of these species and the land, critically important. So the next slide, just for those, just as a refresher, and for those who are new, the Species at Risk Act, the federal government assesses or gives a categorization, if you will, of different species and essentially how at risk they are. So we want to prevent species becoming extinct so they don't exist anywhere in the world, and extirpated, so locally extinct. They were here, but they're no longer here. We also want to recover wildlife species that are extirpated, endangered, or threatened. Those are the different categories. And finally, the last category is those species that we call special concern. They're ones we're really watching carefully for and hoping to recover that they don't become threatened, endangered, or extirpated. The Species at Risk Act is a recovery act. It really helps us understand the species better in their habitat, plan for their recovery, but doesn't look at day-to-day management like some other jurisdictions do, and other types of Species at Risk Act does. And then finally here, conservation is shared jurisdiction, just like I showed in that previous slide with everyone involved. And federally, again, we look at migratory birds, fisheries and oceans, look at aquatic species, and there's on federal lands. And then the provinces and territories really look at everything else. So as you can imagine and maybe familiar with, we work quite closely with the province. And when we talk about some of the species, we'll look at that as well. So the next slide here, going through the different segments of the Act. So it starts off first with the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, or COSUWIC, who does an assessment of how the species is doing, and then they recommend certain species to list under the Species at Risk Act. On the next slide here, the listing recommendation and decision. So the minister is responsible for making the recommendation to governor and council, which is essentially cabinet, and making the decision to list or not list. So that involves consultation and engagement as well. And some of you may have attended the workshop we held in November, where we looked at listing specifically and the species that are being considered for listing this year. And we're very happy to continue discussion. If you weren't able to attend that workshop, not to worry, there's lots of opportunities there. And then the next slide is about recovery planning. And this is where the focus is today. Different species, depending on that ranking I mentioned earlier, get different types of documents, those planning documents, and identifying critical habitat, which I'll touch on how that's defined, is produced for threatened, endangered, and extirpated species where we can. And then finally, I just on the end there, I'll get into a bit more, some of the voluntary actions and stewardship that can happen at any time. So just mention quickly that when a species is listed on federal lands, their residents, so their nest or den or wherever they live, and the individual itself are protected. And later on, down the road, when habitat is identified where it can be, then looking at protection of habitat happens. So I'll go to the next slide, which looks at federal recovery planning, because this is where we're going to focus today. Just wanted to highlight this area a little bit more. So for extirpated, so locally extinct, again, endangered and threatened species, the recovery strategy is prepared. This is a high-level document. It includes Western science, Indigenous knowledge, and looks at what the species need and how it might be recovered. And where possible, includes critical habitat. And then for special concern, same thing, except critical habitat is not identified. And the focus is really on different things that can be done to conserve the species or those conservation measures. And all these documents can be found on the Species at Risk public registry online. On the next slide here, I just wanted to touch on critical habitat. I often hear the question, well, isn't all habitat critical for species at risk? And most definitely all habitat is really, really important for species at risk. Critical habitat is just a term that's used in the Species at Risk Act. So it has this legal definition here that it's the habitat necessary for the survival or recovery of the species, and it's laid out in an action plan. The critical habitat has three parts. It has a map with boundaries. You see that in this image here. And also it has biophysical attributes. So those are the things the species need. So it could be types of vegetation, could be water, could be many different physical things on the landscape that the species needs. So if you're inside these boundaries, there may be things like, I don't know, like shopping centers or parking lots or houses. So those don't have biophysical attributes, so they're not critical habitat. And likewise, just outside the boundaries, because these maps are based on the best information, if those biophysical attributes are outside the boundaries, they're still really important, of course, of the species. And also included in critical habitat are the activities that are likely to destroy habitat. And I'll just mention again, because these documents are super high level, you may see things like forestry or agriculture, really broad categories of activities. And just these activities it's not part and parcel that everything involved in forestry is going to destroy. For example, it could be just certain practices. I just wanted to highlight that. On the next slide here, this is some of the things we focus on when developing recovery documents. So during consultation and cooperation, we tend to focus on these things as a starting point. But like I mentioned, everything can be and should be considered. So we look at where the species and habitat is found, what the species needs to survive, the threats they face, some of the things that we could do together to help recover the species. We look at the population and distribution objectives. So how many individuals, what kind of area do they need to recover and not be at risk any longer? And then anything else that could help in their survival and recovery. And I wanted to highlight here, just on the end and spend a little bit of time, is that Indigenous knowledge that communities would like to share, recognizing not everything can be, should be that you want to share, but what you would like to share, very much we'd like to include, because everything we have that can help the species recover just helps contribute to that becoming a reality. So really hoping to spend a good amount of time today in conversation and in future on how do we do this? How do we do it better? What do you want to see? So the next slide here is just on protection and implementation. This is a huge category or area of work in itself. I'm not going to get into it. We have that workshop coming up probably towards the end of February, likely into March, with land focusing on land management. And this is the area where we can really get into the protection and stewardship side of things in more detail. And then this last slide here, I just wanted to touch on COVID and what that means. So when it comes to species at risk, consultation, cooperation, and accommodation. If you've worked on species at risk in past with us, you'll know that we have these really strict legislated timelines for producing recovery documents, consulting on them, and finalizing them. Well, just like pretty much everything with COVID-19, rules become really flexible. So we're going to continue to work on species at risk. It's a really high priority. The species aren't going to wait around for us to figure things out. So we'll keep working as much as we can, recognizing that many communities are in a state of emergency, have a lot going on, a lot of priorities. These timelines just don't work. So we're being really flexible and responsive, and other presenters will go into what that means with the species they're working on. Just mentioning, we'll take a case-by-case approach. Not everything, one size doesn't fit everybody, so being flexible there. And then just to mention that consultation, cooperation, we know it takes more time than we have under those legislated timelines. With COVID going on, it's going to take that much longer. So we're just anticipating that we're not going to meet our FAIR timelines, and that's okay. So we're not going to rush through things. And then just finally, strange times. And if you have any questions, any concerns, just always reach out to us. And that is the last slide I have here in this presentation. I know it was a lot of information in a really short amount of time, but just hoping to set us up in a good way with some context and highlighting a few areas to help with our conversation today.